Members wishing to change their vote or vote? If not, the motion to table, the ayes are 98, nays are 0. Motion to table is approved.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
on behalf of Senator Reid of Rhode Island, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reid, for Mr. Reid of Rhode Island, proposes an amendment number 2714.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that amendment, Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll. Not yet? I'm sorry.
Mr. President, I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reid, proposes an amendment number 2715 to amendment number 2714.
I have a cloture motion on the Reid amendment. That has to be reported.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the Reid of Rhode Island Amendment number 2714 to S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows. Reid of Nevada, Reid of Rhode Island, Gillibrand, Whitehouse, Schatz, Boxer, Casey, Carper, Warren, Murray, Begich, Brown, Merkley, King, Schumer, Nelson, Coons.
Mr. President, I have a motion to commit S. 1845 with instructions.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reid, moves to commit the bill to the Committee on Finance with instructions to report back, being amendment number 2716.
On this, Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
I have an amendment to the instructions at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reid, proposes an amendment number 2717 to the instructions of the motion to commit.
Lost my place. Ask the yeas and nays, Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Nevada, Mr. Reid, proposes an amendment number 2718 to amendment number 2717.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on S. 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
Waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to calendar number 298, S. 1963.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 298, S. 1963, a bill to repeal Section 403 of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory requirement of Rule 22 be waived for the cloture motion just filed, and that on Wednesday, February 5th, count as an intervening day.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, let me take just a moment to explain where we are. Over the last few months, we've been struggling to try to find a way to help some desperate people in our country, working hard to find a way to convince our Republican colleagues that these people are in a desperate situation and to join with us in extending unemployment insurance benefits for 1.6 million of our fellow citizens. Last month, we tried to pass a bipartisan bill that would simply extend those benefits on a short-term basis for 3 months. All but a few Republicans voted against proceeding to that measure. Republicans complained that we had not paid for the extension, so we offered then a paid-for 11-month extension. Every Republican voted against cloture on that amendment. Every Republican. And all but one Republican voted against cloture on the bipartisan 3-month extension. So today, we're trying yet again. We're offering an amendment that extends, it's for 3 months and pays for that extension, not a disputed, controversial extension, and certainly not a controversial pay for. An alternative also includes something that Senator Colburn's been talking about for several months, an amendment to prevent millionaires from getting unemployment benefits, because it has happened. A person won a lottery and was still doing unemployment benefits. So Thursday, we're going to vote on cloture on that amendment, one that's paid for and would take care of this issue for lots of people. And after that, we'll vote on cloture on the bill as amended, if we amend it. In the meantime, I'm happy to continue discussion with senators about setting up votes on relevant amendments. But, Mr. President, the Republican leader's proposal is absolute absurdity. I mean, I don't know why they just don't come out and say, we're not going to do this. We're not going to extend unemployment benefits. But they have alternating amendments, and they want amendments related to, I mean, it's just a George Mitchell, who was the Democratic leader for a period of time that I served here, a wonderful human being. His statement was, don't depend on the Republicans. They'll break your heart every time. And that's what they're doing. They're breaking our hearts. And the 1.6 million people, their hearts are broken. The main proponent of this bill has been Jack Reed from Rhode Island. Jack Reed and I have a contest I wish we didn't. And that is, which state, Rhode Island or Nevada, has the highest unemployment? We care about this greatly. But others care about this. I'm sure there's some Republicans that care about it. So why are they hung up on this foolishness that they can only do it if one time they have alternating amendments? They wouldn't take 20 amendments. Mr. President, there's a handful of Republicans who have tried really hard, worked in good faith with Senator Reed of Rhode Island. But the problem is, they have no control over the Tea Party-driven Republicans that make up most of this Republican caucus.
Senator Reed. President. Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are at a critical moment. It has been 38 days since emergency unemployment compensation expired, forcing now not 1.6 but 1.7 million Americans off an economic cliff, and also draining $2.2 billion from state economies. And these are according to estimates and data from the Department of Labor and the Ways and Means Committee. So this has had a huge impact on families and a huge impact on the economies throughout this country. And Congress should be doing everything it can to focus on creating jobs and improving our economy. And this week, we have an opportunity to do that. That's why we should vote to renew UI and help put more Americans back to work. And restoring these benefits is an imperative. We must do it. We have to act with a sense of urgency. People are out there every day looking for employment. They're doing everything they can to support their families and themselves. And while this modest level of support helps them stay afloat, what they really want is a job. And so our constituents who are trying so hard and doing what they need to do to provide for themselves and their families are looking to Congress to uphold its end of the bargain. Because frankly, Mr. President, many of our constituents are running out of options. The rent's coming due. The telephone bill is coming due, and without a phone, you can't actively compete for work. There's no way employers can get a hold of you. College tuitions are coming due for middle-aged people who are out there looking for jobs, for their children, and some people who are paying their way through college. They're being squeezed from all sides. and the expiration of these benefits is hurting not just them, but it's hurting our economy overall. Time is of the essence. It's been 7 weeks since Senator Heller and I introduced a bipartisan short-term plan that was designed to provide immediate relief. We tried different permutations of extending these benefits with provisions that the other side said they wanted, but to this point, without success. I must say that I have been found, not only Senator Heller, but many of my colleagues on the side, both thoughtful and willing to contribute. Senator Collins, and Senator Coates, and Senator Portman, and so many others, who are sincere in trying to get this done. But what we have to do is get over this 60-vote threshold, at least to provide this immediate relief of 3 months to our constituents. And again, the face of this unemployment in this downturn is, I think, a bit different than in the past. We're hearing and seeing more and more middle-aged workers who worked all their lives and for the first time are confronted with unemployment. They've sent out hundreds of resumes. They've sought job interviews, many times unsuccessfully. They are squeezed because they're trying to support parents. At the same time, they're trying to support children who are in college or young adults who are at home. This is a tremendous toll on people who have worked hard all their lives. And they're simply asking us to step up, as we've done consistently in the past, and give them some modest support while they search for work. We're a month into 2014, still debating a 3-month fix. At some point, Mr. President, we'll reach the point where the retroactive benefits will be greater than the benefits going forward. That's not a place we want to be, not for people who've worked hard. The only way you qualify for unemployment insurance is to have worked and then, through no fault of your own, to be dismissed from your work. And you still have to look for work. That's the whole program. So it's not right. I think we have to move forward. And we've done this on a bipartisan basis. 3 times under President Ronald Reagan, 5 times under George W. Bush, with overwhelming majorities on a bipartisan basis, no question. And in many times, in fact, in most times, they were completely unpaid for. It was emergency spending. Not only because people needed the money, but it is a great form of economic support to our economy. The CBO estimates that if we fail to extend for the full year these benefits, we will lose another 120,000 jobs at a time when our first priority should be to put more jobs in the marketplace. Now, we have a plan today that is short-term, 3 months, retroactive back to December 28th. It's fully paid for by extending pension smoothing for 4 more years. In addition to paying for these benefits, it will reduce the deficit by $1.2 billion over 10 years. So we have a mechanism that not only helps people, but also goes to the issue of the deficit, which is another pressing concern, particularly by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And this offset has been used several times before. It passed 79-19 as part of the 2012 MAP 21 transportation bill. So this is a non-controversial pay-for. It's been used before. It has been proposed by members on both sides of the aisle for various proposals requiring pay-fors. So we have an urgent need, very short-term focus, and a non-controversial pay-for. And I would urge my colleagues, let's support this. Let's move this. If there's work to be done, the architecture of unemployment insurance, if there are other collateral issues or issues that could be thrown into the mix, let's get this done, and let's focus on those issues. The language also incorporated in this bill a measure that Senator Coburn has proposed that would bar millionaires, individuals making over $1 million, from qualifying for unemployment insurance. This measure has been unanimously supported, 100 to nothing in this chamber. So we thought we would go ahead and put that in as an additional measure that would be embraced by everyone in the chamber. This is an issue that has huge support among the American public. There's a Fox News poll that says over two-thirds of Americans support and want Congress to act now to renew UI for their neighbors. Now, let me just thank again my colleagues on the other side who have worked very sincerely and very diligently to come up with a solution. I say to them, thank you. I appreciate it. My concern is helping, as their concern is, those constituents who are getting increasingly desperate. We share this. Now what we have to do is find a pathway forward. I hope, because of the short-term nature of this bill, because of the non-controversial pay-for, that we can get this done. And then I think we can embark on a much more expansive review and much more expansive set of issues with respect to UI and other issues which come before the chamber. It is time, I think, to vote aye to get this measure passed. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to talk about the attack on our consulate on September 11th of 2012. I am here to talk about the fact that 4 brave Americans were murdered that day by an act of terrorism, and one of them was our ambassador to Libya when those 4 Americans were killed in Benghazi at our consulate. And I want to talk about really what I believe is a pattern of misinformation, misimpressions, and frankly misleading the American people about what happened there, and post, during an election season, what was represented about the attack on our consulate on September 11th. And let me just walk through some of the situation and the tangled web that was really weaved here. First of all, right after this attack that occurred, we know that on September 16th, Ambassador Susan Rice appeared on behalf of the administration on every major Sunday television show, and during that time, people rightly wanted to know what happened. This was a big deal. An ambassador had been murdered, 3 other Americans in Libya, where we had gone in to remove, working with our NATO partners to get rid of Gaddafi, and really had established alliances with Libya. And here we have a murdered ambassador on September 11th. And that day, Ambassador Rice, during the context of a presidential election, went on every Sunday television show, and when she was asked about what happened on that day, she blamed this on the spontaneous reaction to a hateful video. Well, recently the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence did some very good bipartisan work looking at what happened on the attack of the consulate. And in that report is something very, very telling. In that report, the report found that contrary to many press reports at the time, eyewitness statements by U.S. personnel indicate that there were no protests at the start of the attacks. In fact, the then Deputy Director of the CIA received an email sent from the CIA's Chief of Station in Tripoli to him on September 15th, 4 days after the attacks occurred. And in that email, the Deputy Director of the CIA, Mike Morell, was told that the attacks were not an escalation of protests, not an escalation of protests. Why is that important? It's important for many reasons, because what ends up happening during this period is that Ambassador Rice is going on the Sunday shows to talk about this. She's designated to do this on behalf of the administration, and we've always wondered why. Why did she go on as opposed to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, or perhaps then Secretary Panetta, the Secretary of Defense? And she is sent that day onto the Sunday shows, and she, on those shows, said that this was a direct result of a heinous video, protests that came as a result of this video. Yet the day before, the then deputy director of the CIA had already gotten an email from the people on the ground, eyewitness statements, because there were survivors, people who survived this attack that were interviewed to find out, like in any situation where you have had a terrorist attack or a murder case, you're going to talk to the eyewitnesses on the ground. And there were eyewitnesses, they were spoken to, and as a result of those eyewitness interviews, the day before she goes on those Sunday shows, the deputy director of the CIA is told there was not an escalation of protests, that what has been reported, that's not the case. Yet she went on the show and said that anyway. What is even more troubling is that this information is communicated to the deputy director of the CIA, and somehow there's talking points prepared that don't reflect this information. Moreover, we have the President of the United States, and somehow this information that was given to the deputy director of the CIA, nobody tells the President. I don't know. Or they didn't like the story that they received, because during that period of time, if you look at this, on September 11th, the President gave many media interviews during this period. It was a presidential election, and on September 18th, which is 7 days after the attacks on the consulate, 2 days after Susan Rice went on the Sunday shows, the President is on the Dave Letterman show. We've all watched the comedy Dave Letterman show, and Dave Letterman asked him about the attacks on the consulate in Benghazi. And on that show, he blames it on, he talks about the video being, this heinous video being a cause of what happened to the attacks on the consulate. Yet on September 15th, the then deputy director of the CIA already had some information. This is not an escalation of protests. There were interviews done of the survivors on the ground, yet on the Dave Letterman show, a week later, in fact, 3 days after this information is received by the deputy director of the CIA, you have the President talking about the video. But it gets worse. 9 days later, 9 days after the attack, and in fact, so on September 20th, the President gives another interview at the Univision Town Hall. Now, this is 5 days after the deputy director of the CIA is given this information, apparently coming from the survivors. And what does the President say? What we do know is that the natural protests that arose because of the outrage over the video were used as an excuse by extremists to see if they could also directly harm U.S. interests, when he's asked about the attack on our consulate. And so here we have 9 days after the attack, 5 days after this information given to Mike Morell, the then deputy director of the CIA, and yet we have another interview on The View, another popular show. 13 days, almost 2 weeks after the attack on the consulate, and again, the President of the United States talks about this being about the video and a reaction to the video. And so here we have, I think, the work that was done on this, clear misinformation about what happened that day, and very troubling pattern in the context of an election where On those Sunday shows, Ambassador Rice made sure to tell everyone al-Qaeda has been decimated, because that was the narrative during this time period, that al-Qaeda has been decimated, and if this is a terrorist attack, then that's going to be problematic to that narrative. In fact, recently, the President, in fact, we had testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee from then Defense Secretary Panetta. And when he testified before the Armed Services Committee, he said clearly, there is no question in my mind that it was a terrorist attack. And in fact, he said, when I appeared before the Armed Services Committee 3 days after this, I told you it was a terrorist attack. But Secretary Panetta made clear that he knew from the beginning this was a terrorist attack. Yet, the President, again, on September 12th, when, even though the day of it he said, we won't tolerate any act of terror, he's actually asked directly by then the interviewer, Mr. Croft from 60 Minutes, Mr. President, this morning you went out of your way to avoid the use of the word terrorism in connection with the Libya attack. Do you believe that this was a terrorism attack? The President said, well, it's too early to tell exactly how this came about, what group was involved, but obviously it was an attack on Americans. Refusing then to call it what it was, what his own Secretary of Defense knew that it was a terrorist attack, because, of course, we know that the narrative at the time was al-Qaeda has been decimated, and if it was a terrorist attack, it didn't quite fit with that narrative. In fact, recently, the President gave an interview on Fox News with Bill O'Reilly on February 2nd, and what he said is, when he was asked about the attack on the consulate, he said, we revealed to the American people exactly what we understood at the time. The notion that we would hide the ball for political purposes when a week later we all said, in fact, we all said that there was a terrorist attack taking place the day after I said it was an act of terror, that wouldn't be a very good cover-up. Well, I guess the President, when he told Mr. O'Reilly this, that he forgot about the interview that he gave, in fact, on The View, which was almost 2 weeks after this event, 13 days after it, almost 2 weeks later, when, in fact, he was asked by Ms. Behar, I heard Hillary Clinton say it was an act of terrorism. Is it? What do you say? Well, no act of terrorism then. He doesn't acknowledge it. He says, we're still doing an investigation. There's no doubt the kind of weapons that were used, the ongoing assault, that it wasn't just a mob action. This is in the context where, of course, his Secretary of Defense said he knew right away it was an act of terrorism, or in fact he said he came to the Armed Services Committee 3 days after and said it was an act of terrorism. And again, within a week he isn't saying it's an act of terrorism when he's directly asked, wasn't an act of terrorism. Now, in this recent interview with Mr. O'Reilly, the President talked about the security at the consulate. In fact, there was a strong report recently done by the Senate Intel Committee on a bipartisan basis. In fact, one of the issues that they raised deep concerns about it is that the State Department should have increased its security posture more significantly in Benghazi based upon a deteriorating security situation on the ground, and that the threat reporting on the prior attacks against Westerners in Benghazi, there were many cables leading up to this, too, that have been made public. They warranted that there was sufficient warning that the security bench should have been increased at the consulate. And the President acknowledged that in his recent interview with Mr. O'Reilly, where he said in the aftermath what became clear was that the security was lax, that not all the precautions that needed to be taken were taken, and that's certainly confirmed by the bipartisan Senate Intel Committee. If that's the case, why is it that Ambassador Susan Rice was on the Sunday shows on September 16th, where she sent on the shows to talk about what happened that day, and she's directly asked by Chris Wallace in an interview. He says terror cells in Benghazi had carried out 5 attacks since April, including a bombing at the same consulate in June. Should U.S. security have been tighter at that consulate given the history of terror activity in Benghazi? What's her response? Well, we obviously did have a strong security presence. But not only that, on other interviews that she gave that day, she was on several shows, ABC with George Stephanopoulos, she was on Face the Nation with Bob Schieffer, and she was asked during the course of those interviews about the security at the consulate, and she also described it as significant and substantial, the security at the consulate that day. Well, what was the basis for that? Did anyone give her information that the consulate that day, the security was significant, substantial, and strong? Because there was absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, everything found in this investigation has shown that the security was absolutely lax at that consulate, unacceptably so, given the prior history of intelligence at the consulate, given the prior attacks that had been made, not only on the British, on the Red Cross, and this really was, unfortunately, a death trap. And so why is she then, in the context of an election, not only pushing the video story, the president is as well, but also saying, yeah, the consulate security was strong, it was substantial, it was significant, when there's no evidence to support that, it all goes to the contrary. Finally, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that about the video. Ambassador Rice went on the Sunday shows. She talks about the video. She talks about the causal effect of the video in terms of the attacks on the consulate. In fact, what she says essentially is that this was a direct result of a heinous and offensive video that was widely disseminated, and that the U.S. government had nothing to do with, which we have made clear is reprehensible and disgusting. And we have also been very clear in saying that there's no excuse for violence, that we have condemned it in the strongest possible terms. This direct result of a heinous and offensive video, which she said on all those Sunday shows, which the president then also talked about in the interviews that I have just referenced, the interview a week later on David Letterman, the interview 9 days after the attack on Univision, the interview almost 2 weeks later on The View, where they're still talking about the video. I've always thought it was fascinating from the beginning, the talking points. These talking points were created for dissemination, and in fact, Ambassador Susan Rice was given these talking points. She said she relied upon them, and there are serious deficiencies with these talking points. But even so, I challenge people to find any reference to a video in this talking points. I looked and I looked and I looked, and I couldn't see the word video in these talking points anywhere. Yet we have Ambassador Susan Rice on behalf of the administration on September 16th, every Sunday show talking about the video. The President of the United States on David Letterman a week later talking about the video. The President 9 days later after the attack on Univision talking about a video. Almost 2 weeks later, 13 days later on The View talking about a video. And yet there isn't a reference to a video in these talking points. I've never understood, where did the video story come from? Do you think we'll ever get the answer to that? Because I think we deserve an answer to that, especially now that because of the recent Senate Intel report, we know that the Deputy Director of the CIA, the day before Ambassador Rice first appeared on those Sunday shows to tell this story, that he received this email that reported that the attacks were not an escalation of protests. So if it's not an escalation of protests, let's look at these talking points again. These talking points don't refer to a video. We are not sure how that story got told. But then why is it that the talking points that did go out said that available current information suggests that demonstrations in Benghazi were spontaneously inspired by the protests at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo and involved into a direct assault against our U.S. diplomatic post in Benghazi and subsequently its annex, and that they were participating in violent demonstrations. So how come what he learned the day before wasn't taken into account in terms of what was represented to the American people? And I think a bigger question is, how is it that the Deputy Director of the CIA can receive relevant and important information, and that information never gets to the President of the United States as late as 9 days later? Because on September 24th, on The View, he's still talking about this video, yet it turns out that the video never had anything to do with this. So, you know, it really raises so many questions in terms of the tangled web of this whole situation. And I have yet to talk about what was an incredible change in these talking points, which was the removal of the reference to al-Qaeda. The original set of talking points, before they went through various modifications, talked about al-Qaeda or the potential of al-Qaeda-affiliated groups being involved in these attacks. Of course, that now has been confirmed by the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee report recently revealed. But at the time, the reference to al-Qaeda was removed from these talking points. And it was removed from these talking points, and Ambassador Rice was free to go on the Sunday shows September 16th, and she said al-Qaeda had been decimated. Imagine if the talking points had kept the reference to al-Qaeda. Do you think that she would have gone on every Sunday show and said al-Qaeda had been decimated? I would hope not, because it was not true that al-Qaeda had been decimated, as evidenced by the attack on our consulate. So we still don't know who removed the reference and what happened with these talking points. But what really troubles me also is that the Deputy Director of the CIA, who the Senate Intelligence Committee report says received this email on September 15th that said the attacks were not an escalation of protests, he worked on these talking points. He was part of the group that actually had feedback on the talking points that went out the door, and yet somehow this wasn't included. The al-Qaeda reference was removed, and apparently no one, even after receiving the actual eyewitness interviews of what happened on the scene, ever thought to go to the administration, the President of the United States, and correct him. By the way, we're not sure this video really, this pans out, that it's a demonstration, this is a protest in response to a video. Yet somehow that doesn't get up the chain of command. We got big problems if that kind of information is not getting up the chain of command, and that's never been answered as to why that would happen and why those representations were made when there was intel that contradicted it. Finally, most of all, the President said that he was going to bring the individuals that committed these attacks to justice. No one has been brought to justice. And for the families who lost loved ones because of the terrorist attack on our consulate, they deserve to have these terrorists brought to justice. And in fact, you know, what we've seen in some of the reports, the Intel Committee itself essentially identifies that more than a year after the Benghazi attacks, the terrorists who perpetrated the attacks have still not been brought to justice. the intelligence community has identified several individuals responsible for the attack. So, the attacks, I should say, because these were more than one attack. And so the intelligence community has identified those responsible for these attacks. And in fact, some of these individuals have been identified with a strong level of competence. So why hasn't anyone been brought to justice? Why haven't we pursued this to pick the people who committed these terrorist attacks up, to get them, to hold them accountable? The victims deserve justice, and they have not seen justice. And I hope that we will get those individuals, these terrorists, that murdered our ambassador and 3 other brave Americans on September 11th of 2012, and bring them to justice, because it is totally unacceptable that that has not happened right now. And in fact, what really bothers me is we have seen press reports of people like Abu Khatala, who has been associated, reported to have established Ansar al-Sharia, an al-Qaeda-affiliated group, that they've identified him as a prior commander of this group, that witnesses at the attacks identified this man as being there that night during the attacks on our consulate, and yet we haven't picked him up or anyone else. In fact, he's giving press interviews. It's, sitting at cafes, and press in the United States are able to find him, interview him, talk to him, and yet we haven't brought anyone in. We haven't brought him in. There's been reports that there may be a secret warrant for him in some of the news reports, and yet he hasn't been brought in. So where is the attention to this? I've talked about this tangled web that has been weaved that is really troubling in terms of the misimpressions and misleading nature of how this has been misrepresented to the American people. But I would hope that we would all focus on bringing the people who committed these terrorist attacks to justice, because the victims of these terrorist attacks deserve justice. And by the way, the terrorists that committed these acts against our consulate, they need to know that we're coming after them, that we're going to hold them accountable. You commit a terrorist attack against our country, and you should not be in a position to be out drinking coffee in a cafe. You need to be held accountable so that we can send a message to other terrorists: don't mess with the United States of America. And right now they're getting the opposite message, with no one being held accountable for the attacks, the terrorist attacks on our consulate on September 11th of 2012. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'd like to commend the senator from New Hampshire for her stirring remarks on the terrorist attack in Benghazi, and urge that we pay heed to the words she just said. It is striking that the senator from New Hampshire has said more about that terrorist attack than our commander-in-chief has ever said. Mr. President, we're at a time where Tolkien's classic The Hobbit is one of the best-selling, most popular movies in the country. The Hobbit is a fantasy story. And in Washington, we were visited with fantasy last week in the President's State of the Union address. I'd like to talk today about the contrast concerning foreign policy between the fantasy that was presented to the American people and the cold, hard realities of the dangerous world in which we live, which is only getting more and more dangerous. In his State of the Union address last week, President Obama gave some revealing clues as to how he believes the United States should interact with the rest of the world. On the whole, his remarks encouraged Americans not to worry too much about international challenges, as he suggested the situations in Syria and Iran are being deftly managed by American diplomats, that al-Qaeda is now a regional nuisance that can be outsourced to surrogates, that our relationship with Israel is defined by the Palestinian peace process, which will also be resolved in short order through American diplomacy, that our interest in Ukraine is to express support for the abstract principle that all people should peacefully participate in their own governments. In this rosy scenario, difficult challenges such as the deadly terrorist attacks on Benghazi on September 11, 2012, or the long and painful ordeal of Pastor Saeed Abedini in an Iranian prison simply do not exist. I wish we all lived in the utopian world that President Obama painted last week. But in just a week, picking up the newspaper, numerous news reports have come out to suggest that that picture belongs far more in the world of fantasy than reality. In the interest of being honest with the American people, which I wish our Commander-in-Chief had done, I would like to contrast reality with what we were told last week. On Syria, in the State of the Union, the President claimed, quote, American diplomacy, backed by the threat of force, is why Syria's chemical weapons are being eliminated. And we will continue to work with the international community to usher in the future the Syrian people deserve, a future free of dictatorship, terror, and fear. Truly a rosy scenario. And yet, what is the reality? On Sunday, just 4 days after the President delivered the State of the Union address, Secretary of State John Kerry reportedly told a congressional delegation that the administration's Syria policy is on the brink of collapse. Syria's chemical weapons are purportedly being destroyed through the intervention of Vladimir Putin in what was a major diplomatic victory for the Russian strongman. But we have learned in recent days that this process has not proceeded as promised. The Syrians have ignored their deadlines, and only 4% of the stockpiles have been eliminated, undoubtedly because Assad knows that there is no compelling reason for him to comply. As for what the Syrian people deserve, after 3 years of rudderless U.S. policy, over 130,000 are dead. Millions are refugees displaced across the region. And the oldest Christian communities on the planet are threatened with extinction. Assad is entrenched, and al-Qaeda is in control of the opposition. Sadly, as a result of the President's mismanagement, today we have no good options in Syria. And yet not a word of that made it into his State of the Union address. On Iran, the President claimed, quote, it is American diplomacy, backed by pressure, that has halted the progress of Iran's nuclear program. The reality, Mr. President, is quite different. No enriched uranium has been destroyed, not a pound, and no centrifuges have been dismantled. The Iranians quickly refuted the President's claim in the State of the Union, announcing quite publicly that they have not halted their progress in the slightest. America's closest ally in the region, the nation of Israel, has called this a, quote, very, very bad deal. Indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu has referred to it as an historic mistake. And yet the President proceeds on and the United States Senate refuses even to allow a vote on reimposing sanctions to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. There has been no renunciation of Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism that killed Americans in Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the mullahs have gone on a hanging spree, executing some 40 people in the first 2 weeks of January alone. Meanwhile, billions of dollars are flowing into the country, both through relaxed sanctions and Iran's reemergence as a legitimate business partner because of this administration's misguided deal. Indeed, Iranian President Rouhani might almost be forgiven for publicly gloating that, quote, "The Geneva deal means the surrender of the big powers in front of the great nation of Iran." Mr. President, I wish he were not speaking the truth. But that reality did not emerge on the House floor last week. On the House floor, the President claimed, quote, "If John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan could negotiate with the Soviet Union, then surely a strong and confident America can negotiate with less powerful adversaries today." The reality is that the claim that we are negotiating with Iran from a position of strength and confidence is a blinkered view of reality, because it isn't even clear our president is negotiating towards actual victory. Capitulation is not victory. President Obama announced in the State of the Union that in order to keep negotiations going, he would veto any additional sanctions Congress might pass to pressure Iran to actually stop pursuing nuclear weapons. A position that is supported not only by his current administration, but expressly by his former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has good reason to announce publicly he has no, quote, fear of Congress. When Ronald Reagan negotiated with the Soviets, he did it from a clear strategic perspective of we win, they lose, standing for U.S. national interest. He was facing an existential threat that he defined as an evil empire. There was no danger of misunderstanding what the goal was or who was going to be doing the surrendering. And as a result of his leadership, the Cold War was won without firing a shot. Today, Mr. President, on Iran, we are tragically repeating the mistakes of the past, in particular, the mistakes of the Clinton administration in relaxing sanctions on North Korea for the same empty promises that they would cease developing nuclear weapons, only to have North Korea use the billions of dollars we sent to them or allowed to go to them to develop nuclear weapons. The difference is the North Korean leader is motivated by staying in power, which means some form of rational deterrence is hopefully possible. In Iran, the supreme leader has made clear his desire to destroy the nation of Israel, and as a result of the billions of dollars going to Iran right now, the risk is unacceptably high that we discover the same thing that happened in North Korea happened in Iran, except that we discover it because Iran, in pursuit of jihad, detonates a nuclear device over Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. Not a word of that was acknowledged in the President's speech. On al-Qaeda, President Obama claimed, quote, "We have put al-Qaeda's core leadership on a path to defeat." The threat has evolved as al-Qaeda affiliates and other extremists take root in different parts of the world. In Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, and Mali, we have to keep working with partners to disrupt and disable those networks. The reality, Mr. President, whatever path al-Qaeda is on, it does not currently appear to be towards defeat. The recent assertion by a State Department spokeswoman that Ayman al-Zawahiri is the only core al-Qaeda member left, and thus the threat has been decimated by the President, is demonstrably false. For starters, Zawahiri is no mere abstract threat. He explicitly called for attacks on the United States on September 10th, 2012, the day before the terrorist attack that claimed the lives of 4 Americans in Benghazi, including the first U.S. ambassador killed on duty since 1979. And Zawahiri is actively involved in directing al-Qaeda groups that are active in Syria. But core or non-core, whatever that means, the reality is that al-Qaeda has been at war with the United States for more than 2 decades. And the attacks of September 11th, 2001 are only the most spectacular of a series of attacks and attempted attacks launched at us. Trying to parse this threat to make it seem less deadly, to make it seem like less of a threat to Americans, will not make it so. We need to confront what attacked us in 2001. You cannot defeat radical Islamic terrorism when the President seems unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. And indeed, the recent Senate Select Committee on Intelligence documented that what attacked us in Libya in 2012 is the very same thing that attacked us on September 11th, 2001. We should not aim simply to disrupt or to disable al-Qaeda terrorists. We should aim to defeat them. On Israel, Mr. President, the State of the Union, the President had one mention of Israel in that speech. He said, quote, "American diplomacy is supporting Israelis and Palestinians as they engage in difficult but necessary talks to end the conflict there, to achieve dignity and an independent state for Palestinians, and a lasting peace and security for the State of Israel, a Jewish state that knows America will always be at their side." The reality, Mr. President, is sadly much different. Over the weekend, we saw a diplomatic spat play out in the press over allegations that Secretary of State Kerry is actively working behind the scenes to encourage European countries to threaten Israel with boycotts if the Israelis don't agree to whatever framework Mr. Kerry will propose in 2 weeks. Rather than threats from the U.S. Secretary of State, and rather than tweets from National Security Advisor Susan Rice criticizing Israel, instead the United States should stand unequivocally with our friend and ally, the nation of Israel. We should reaffirm Israel's unique status as a strong democratic ally in the Middle East, a uniquely Jewish state, and that the United States appreciates the excruciatingly difficult security situation in which Israel finds itself with the threat of a nuclear Iran, and that the United States will vigorously defend Israel from attacks, from international institutions, from legal onslaughts, and from attempts to undermine Israel's economy through punitive boycotts. And that the United States is unshakably committed to preserving Israel's security regardless of the status of the peace process. Mr. President, I would commend to you the recent remarks Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper gave in Israel. Those are the remarks of an ally standing strong with Israel and appreciating the incredible value that Israel provides to our national security and to peace in the world. I wish that our President could speak with a fraction of the clarity and solidarity with Israel that the Canadian Prime Minister recently provided. On Ukraine, the President claimed, quote, In Ukraine, we stand for the principle that all people have a right to express themselves freely and peacefully and to have a say in their country's future. The reality, Mr. President, is the day after the State of the Union, Ukraine's former president said that the country teeters on the brink of civil war. Protesters have been brutally tortured and murdered. Indeed, one opposition leader described how he was recently crucified. The Ukrainian people's constitutional rights have been trampled. This former Soviet republic has been wrenched away from a proposed trade agreement with the EU and a path towards NATO membership, and instead thrust back into Russia's sphere of influence by a corrupt and autocratic leader, depriving the United States of an important economic and security partner. Mr. President, we need to tell this story. We need to look for concrete actions we can take right now to demonstrate real support for the opposition, to demonstrate real support that Ukraine is welcomed by the West, and that we will not accede to Putin's efforts to reassemble the old Soviet Union and place Ukraine under its domination. We can start by immediately offering a free trade agreement to Ukraine and partnerships to help them build natural gas infrastructure so that they need not remain dependent upon Russia, which uses natural gas to blackmail them. And we could immediately release exports of liquid natural gas from the United States in conjunction with helping with that infrastructure. Surely the people gathering in the frozen snow of Maiden Square, crying out for the freedom of the West, deserve more from the leader of the free world than mere blandishments about abstract universal rights. If you're standing in the frozen streets of Kiev, being beaten, bleeding, naked as one opposition leader was, and yet standing proud for freedom, empty generalities from the President do you very little good. On Benghazi, the President claimed nothing. We all remember last fall during the debates in the presidential election, just over a year ago, when the President emphatically stated no one cared more about the terrorist attack that happened in Benghazi than he did. And yet in the year and a half that has followed, the word Benghazi seems never to leave his lips. The reality is we have 4 Americans murdered in a preventable attack. And that's what the Senate Intelligence Committee concluded in a bipartisan manner, that this was preventable by al-Qaeda terrorists. And more than 16 months later, no one in Washington or Libya has been held accountable. Congress and the American people, and particularly the families of the fallen, deserve the answers that only a joint select committee of Congress could get. And yet, sadly, Mr. President, the majority leader and Democrats in this chamber are blocking a joint select committee. What difference does it make? Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, it makes all the difference in the world to ascertain the truth. Now, I will note, even though he said not a word about Benghazi in the State of the Union, he was forced to say something this week when he was interviewed by Bill O'Reilly. During the halftime of the Super Bowl, when Bill O'Reilly asked him about Benghazi, what is striking, Mr. President, I would urge everyone to go and watch and listen to what the President said. Bill O'Reilly asked him, did Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta tell him that that night that the attacks were the works of terrorists? Mr. O'Reilly asked that question, and yet the President over and over and over again refused to answer a simple yes or no. Did Leon Panetta tell him it was the act of terrorists? He did not want to answer that question, and indeed, he did not. For those of us that have spent some of our career in a court of law, The technical term for his answer was non-responsive, and were a judge there, he would have directed the President to answer the question that was put to him. Nor did the President say one word about why the talking points were scrubbed to eradicate any mention of terrorism and the al-Qaeda affiliates involved. Mr. President, we need accountability. We need accountability for those four brave Americans who lost their lives to terrorism. And we need to know why no one has been held accountable in the State Department, nor that any of the terrorists who committed that attack have been brought to justice. And Mr. President, Saeed Abedini, the American pastor brutally imprisoned in Iran. President Obama in the State of the Union address said nothing. The reality is an American citizen has been wrongfully imprisoned in Iran for more than a year simply for professing his Christian faith. All of us are blessed to live in a land where the Constitution guarantees us religious liberty. And yet a Christian pastor going to Iran, professing his faith, was thrown in a pit of a jail. There is no more compelling evidence that the supreme leader in Tehran represents the very same repressive Islamist regime today that he has for so many years, and that his goal is not peaceful rapprochement with the West, but the preservation of his own power. The President of the United States should be standing up and demanding Pastor Saeed Abedini's release, not making his captors into diplomatic partners. Indeed, it is notable, in the midst of our negotiations in Geneva, the nation of Iran transferred Pastor Saeed Abedini from one horrible prison to an even worse prison where they keep their death row, where they send people to die. And he did so on the anniversary of Iran's taking Americans hostage, what is referred to in Iran as Death to America Day. Mr. President, that was not accidental. That was meant to thumb their nose at our nation, and the President, instead of standing up for an American wrongfully imprisoned for preaching his Christian faith, the President instead chose in the State of the Union address to say not a word. The President concluded his speech on foreign policy by saying, quote, "Finally, let us remember that our leadership is defined not just by our defense against threats, but by the enormous opportunities to do good and promote understanding around the globe, to forge greater cooperation, to expand new markets, to free people from fear and want. And no one is better positioned to take advantage of those opportunities than America." Mr. President, the reality is, if this past week has proven anything, it is that American leadership is not defined by global opportunities to do good and promote understanding. American leadership is defined by defending and promoting the values that have made our nation great. We don't do this by ignoring unpleasant realities, refusing to acknowledge the terrorist attack in Benghazi, sending administration officials out to claim it is not a terrorist attack but the result of an internet video, or refusing to stand for an American wrongfully imprisoned in Iran for preaching his Christian faith. And we don't do this by refusing to admit failure, but by standing up and facing our challenges, accepting responsibility for our actions, and speaking out with a clarion voice for the freedoms we enjoy. Freedoms that should be the aspiration of every man and woman on the planet. Leading from behind does not work. As a result of this administration's misguided foreign policy, the world has become a much more dangerous place in the last 5 years. U.S. national security interests have been endangered dramatically. We see nations like Russia increasing their sphere of influence, while the threats to the security of men and women throughout America grow and multiply. Standing strongly with like-minded allies. And encouraging others to seek freedom is not disinterested do-gooding. It is vital work that will promote the security and prosperity of the United States of America, something that I believe is ultimately in the interest of all mankind. I wish when the President of the United States stood on the floor of the House of Representatives to address the nation and address the world, that when he spoke of foreign policy, that he had not embraced a foreign policy fantasy that disregards the cold, hard reality of the dangerous world we live in and the consequences of receding U.S. leadership. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I rise today to address two issues. The first is what's before us. That's the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Extension Act. And the second is